supernatural is something that isn't supposed to happen, but it does happen.
And no nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space.
What does it take to convince you that the dead do not always rest in peace?
Care is the proud sponsor of the program, and it's handcrafted right here in Winter Garden, Florida, by Kelly Brott himself. Check him out. Go to brottsbeardcare.com. We've got beard soap, beard oil, our signature blend that Chris is showing right there. That one is made specially for us. You, by purchasing that, you're not only supporting Kelly, you're also supporting us, and we really appreciate you for that. Check him out. Use promo code 3beards with a capital B. You're going to save 20% off your order. It's also sponsored by Nanny Cakes and Chris's Swear Jar. We've instituted that to help him try to watch his mouth. So yeah,
we're up to 30 cents so far.
Yes, so you know, he's self-sponsoring the program. So at this time, we would really like to welcome our guest of the evening, Jason Jarrell, author of Ages of the Giants, A Cultural History of the Tall Ones in Prehistoric America. Him and his wife, Sarah Farmer, they wrote this book. Jason, welcome to the show. And Mark Eddy, our secret agent booking man who helps us get all this stuff, he's come to help us as well. So welcome, both of you.
Thank you for having me. I didn't realize you had a swear jar. Do you guys take PayPal for that? Because
well, no, that's not for you. That you guys are fine. We started this kind of started today actually. He there's sometimes like he just goes on a long tirade that makes all of us our eyes start watering just from the string of. I didn't even know you could group some of those words and the combinations he was finding. So we started a swear jar. Yeah, I was. Yeah, there was different combinations. I was like, I don't think I've ever heard those words strung together before. It was pretty impressive.
So language is an art form.
Yes. He swearsive. I'm not sure what you call it. But yeah, it's just swearzili. I don't know.
God.
So Mark brought this up to us, and I listened to the show when you were on with him and Barbara on night. And that I got fascinated as we're starting to get with some of the topics of giants, and I mean we've had a few people on that have talked about Gary Wayne. We've talked about Nephilim and the giants, and it was kind of a perfect segue to bring you in here because now we have there's that mystery of where did they go. They were there, the flood came, they've disappeared, and then there's always reports of around the world, these things, different areas, these are being found. Well, here we are into the New World, the Northern Hemisphere, and we have these giant burial mounds and stuff. And we're wondering, as we go into this part, where this might have been a possible location, but it's also this might have just been, as like I said, if you guys have done your research, and that's where I wanted to bring you in to see, how yours fits into that model, or if it's something like you have a whole different break off in that. So I'll let you take it from there.
Okay, well, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the subject. The field of what people are referring to as the ancient giants, it really is a type of a spectrum. On one end of that spectrum, you have the most incredible, sensational statements you can imagine. You'll find people who claim that the remains in these burial mounds in North America.
That would be the host not doing his job in silence.
Oh my God.
I apologize for this.
Wow.
Continue.
Wait, isn't it time for a swear chain when something like that happens?
Oh my God. Craig.
I'm a professional. Yes, I am.
So
sorry about that. Continue.
Well, first of all, my work is it's different than the majority of the research projects that are out there on the subject. The burial mounds here in North America, where the large skeletons have been found, many of these mounds are just over 2,000 years old, and an equal number of those mounds were built within the last 1,000 years. So we are certainly not talking about a pre-diluvian or pre-flood culture when it comes to the mounds here in the eastern woodlands, places like Ohio, West Virginia, where the large skeletal remains have been found. And a big part of our research project, we were really walking in the footsteps of a Native American philosopher named Vine Deloria Jr. And Vine believed that these beings existed, and he consulted the Native American elders in his time, and the Native American elders explained to him that, in fact, the tall ones, which is what they called them, had existed among the Native American people generally in ancient times. In other words, they were widespread among all the tribes. And that's exactly what we found in our research project, because our goal was to go beyond the history books and the local newspaper accounts. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of those that you can find on archive.org. You can find them in old newspapers and press clippings of farmers and other types of people who would find these skeletons in the mounds in the Ohio Valley and other places in North America that they would report as being of gigantic size. And our goal was to discover whether or not there was any real scientifically documented proof that there was actually something to this phenomenon. And what we found is that there is something to discover here, but it is not what most people who are interested in the subject today seem to believe that it is. Because
go ahead. I'm sorry. I was going to ask you a question, but I didn't mean to interrupt there.
Well, questions are good.
No, it was one. I'm going to absolutely butcher this. I mean, so you're probably going to help me out. I mean, because it's like, it is a long Indian name. Is that the Ranonga Tawanaka? I think is how you say it.
Yeah, you're talking about one of the legends of a battle with giants. And what people need to understand when it comes to the legends about Indians having wars with tribes of giants is that it was a common myth that every tribe handed down in different forms, and the names of the giants in the myth change based on which linguistic group we're talking about. So you could say that, for example, in Christianity, we have a lot of events in the New Testament which different cultures have handed down, and they may explain it differently in their own language. It's a common motif of a battle with giants. But what the other side of that story is that most people are unfamiliar with is that this is a story that was told in the same setting that, people would warn their children not to wander too far from a camp because a giant could kidnap them and eat them. Wow. Giants were a common mythic motif among Native American people, just as they were other people all around the world. And when it comes to the actual reality of what was found in the ancient mounds, the Adena-Hopewell culture, that's the name of the cultures who buried these large remains in the mounds in the Ohio Valley, date to between 500 BC and about 450 AD. And the bones that were found in the mounds, usually when they are large skeletons, measure somewhere on a scale of 7 to 8 feet in stature. All of the accounts and reports of skeletons measuring 9 and 10 and even 12 feet that you find in old press clippings and local histories You can debunk most of those accounts as soon as you look for the primary source for the excavation. But in the Ohio Valley, in the 20th century, we have a number of archaeologists. Don Dragoo from the University of Carnegie. You have William S. Webb from the University of Kentucky. You have George Fisher, who did research in Pennsylvania. All of these archaeologists did record skeletons falling along that spectrum that they found in the mounds of this culture. And even in some instances, they published photographs of the remains in their own excavation reports that we've acquired. The people who participated in these cultures along the Ohio River were generally, even the people of regular stature, were more powerfully built than people who live today. Their bones were very thick. They had very large jaw bones, very large teeth, and the physical anthropologists who studied the bones wrote about the marked eminences on the bones for the attachment of powerful muscles. So this was a population of generally powerfully built individuals with recurring instances of people who were 7 feet in stature and above. The tallest skeleton, the largest skeleton that we have found verified in a primary excavation report comes from a report that we only recently obtained from Southern Ohio. An archaeologist excavating an archaic burial site measures 2 femurs from a skeleton that, if his measurements are accurate in the report, would have been probably exceeding 8 feet in stature. But that is the largest of these skeletons that I personally have ever seen verified by a primary archaeological report.
Now, just kind of stop you right there for a little bit. What is, in your opinion, like kind of a theory on where the divergent came between the let's say normal, but Indian tribes, where the stature, because they're typically somewhere between 5-6 feet tall, and then you have this race that's 7 to 8 feet tall. So where did this sudden expansive growth come from for this group that didn't translate to the rest in the area?
Well, that's a good question, but even many of the skeletons that did not reach even 7 feet in stature, the regular population, it's an interesting thing that one of the archaeologists who excavated the majority of the Adena Mounds in the Ohio Valley, William S. Webb, partnered with a physical anthropologist named Charles Snow to study all of the surviving skeletons of the Adena people. And they wrote in their literature about the frequency with which Adena males and many of the females were 6 feet in stature, 6 feet 3 inches in stature. Don Dragoo, who was a later archaeologist that confirmed the tall ones from an excavation in West Virginia, also wrote about how even the base population had people that were commonly over 6 feet in height. So, this phenomenon was probably more widespread than the skeletons that we were able to measure, simply because of the practice of cremation. Most of the burials were cremated. The bones were destroyed. In fact, the majority of the dead from these cultures were cremated. In some of the larger Hopewellian mounds in southern Ohio, there are many hundreds of individuals who were cremated and their ashes scattered in the same mound. So we really have no idea how common this phenomenon was in the base population. But one thing that we certainly do know, and this is a lot of the evidence for this, is what's going to be in the second volume of our series of books. I've spent 2 years collecting the evidence for what I'm about to say. These people were 100% genetically Native Americans. And there have been DNA tests that have been performed on literally hundreds of mound builder skeletons from these cultures. In several cases, skeletons that did possess the unique physical features that prove that these are Native American people. And besides that, in places like southern Ontario and along the Atlantic coast, genetic anthropologists and linguistic scholars have joined forces to actually associate this culture with specific tribes. For example, we know that the Ojibwa ancestors were among the mound builders. We know that the Shawnee ancestors were among the mound builders. We know that many of the Siouan-speaking tribes were among the mound builders. And when you come up through history and you get to the 1700s and the 1800s, if you read closely into the historical texts, you'll find that the first Europeans to encounter those linguistic groups often wrote about the giant people among them. In fact, there are just as many accounts of European people encountering living tall ones among the Algonquian and Siouan-speaking people as there are ancient accounts of large skeletons from these more ancient sites. So there's never really a point in history where the tall ones vanish. It's a unique feature of Native American heritage. The real mystery is why. Why did this sort of optimal genetic expression manage to find its way down through prehistory and all the way into historic times among this people?
Hey, Jason, I have a question. You're living within easy driving distance of where all the Kanawha Valley mounds were located, and the Bureau of Ethnology reports 5 in 12. Elaborate on like this 60-mile-long necropolis.
Oh, sure. Well,
yeah, it's it's really fascinating reading about all the mounds that line both sides of the river from Charleston to Point Pleasant. What made this area so special? Because it seems like there was a really high concentration of giants found in this small location.
Sure. Well, in my book, we have a large section on the area you're talking about. And what happens is in the late 1800s, the Smithsonian, you never trust the United States government to do anything right, especially if it has anything to do with ancient history. If you want a great example of how badly the United States government handles everything that we give it power to do, you can just look at what the Smithsonian did in the late 1800s in the Ohio Valley, because at that point, the Eastern Mound Division completely annihilated hundreds of the most important Adena-Hopewell burial mounds with reckless abandon. We have no idea exactly how many mounds they destroyed. And in many instances, they reported the discoveries in the mounds with the word rubbish. So we have no way to know specifically which arrowheads or spear points or potteries were found in the mounds, which for people like me, that's how we identify a culture. We need to have access to the artifacts, then we can date the mounds. But one thing the Smithsonian did manage to do, especially here in Charleston, West Virginia, along the Kanawha River, where they destroyed 50 Adena burial mounds and surveyed somewhere between 8 and 10 circular henges, circular sun temples constructed by the Adena people. One thing that they were able to do here was record numerous large skeletons from the Adena mounds. In fact, one of the largest Adena skeletons on record was discovered at the Great Smith Mound in Charleston by a Smithsonian agent named P.W. Norris. And he measures the skeleton in the Smithsonian report as around 7 feet and 6 inches in length, I believe. In another unpublished account, Norris wrote that the skeleton might have been as tall as 8 feet, but that's not in the official report. And there were several other skeletons from the same mound, which were too badly damaged to give an exact measurement, but you can tell from the language used in the report that they were extremely large. And this was the case for many of the mounds here. The Adena culture built burial mounds on both sides of the Kanawha River at modern South Charleston in West Virginia, and it was probably because the river was here, because the ancient Native Americans held the same cosmological scheme in their religious rituals and in their conceptions of the divine that modern Native Americans do. And in that cosmology, an important body of water, such as a river or a lake or an ocean, is a gateway to the underworld. And in the underworld dwells a being usually known as the Great Serpent. And it is from the Great Serpent that the shamans and priests can learn the secrets of immortality and healing. In some versions of the tradition, the souls of the dead travel through the underworld on their journey to join the ancestors in the realm above. And that is why, whether it's along the Ohio River or even ancient burials in the St. Lawrence Seaway, that far north, ancient Native Americans would construct these sacred sites near important bodies of water.
Now, what's your theory on that, about why the Smithsonian, has taken such an interest in ensuring that none of this survives? I mean, because this, to me, myself, this seems like something that, you got the theories of this, just, this throws a really big issue into Darwin, theory of Darwin, that this derails that, so they can't have that. I mean, we don't even want to think about this. So what's your biggest leading theory that you, your wife, other people in your field have come to, like, we really think this might be the leading cause for why the Smithsonian cannot have this stuff come out?
Well, the leading cause is actually on record. What we're dealing with is not a modern cover-up. What the Smithsonian is doing today is towing a party line that has been in place for well over 100 years. The actual cover-up happened in the early 1900s, and I can explain. It may be best if I just review the whole history of this situation and lay it out there.
Oh, sure.
Sure.
So, in the 1800s, the Smithsonian launched a massive program desecrating thousands of ancient graves all across the United States, looking for artifacts and remains. And in the Ohio Valley, that included the burial mounds containing these large skeletal remains. And at first, the Smithsonian agents simply reported what they found. They measured the skeletons. We have accounts of Smithsonian agents measuring the skeletons by the femur. So the argument that they didn't know how to properly measure the bones is a fraud. I've heard that argument. Of course, I could believe that a government agent would not know how to properly measure, but in this case, we know they did. So the Smithsonian recorded these discoveries. They found multitudes of large skeletons in the mounds. But what happens is in 1910, mark that date, 1910, an individual named Elise Hrdlicka became the head of the Department of Anthropology at the Smithsonian. And the Department of Anthropology also was in charge of curating all of the skeletal remains that have been found by the Eastern Mound Division in the late 1800s. And what's important about Elise Hrdlicka is he was an outspoken and prominent and very influential member of an organization called the American Eugenics Society. And the American Eugenics Society at that time was promoting a theory of Caucasian racial supremacism throughout the United States. And they, at a certain point, because it was partnered with powerful families like the Carnegie family and the Rockefeller family and the Ford family, at a certain point they were able to influence government policy. And that's why we had in the early 20th century, we had all these marriage laws and forced sterilization laws, all these eugenics-based laws that were designed to create what in their minds was a more pure racial composition for the United States population. And one of the groups that they had targeted for complete extermination was the Native American people. Now, what's important to bear in mind about American eugenics is it is impossible to understand this concept without going into European eugenics, because eugenics was actually born in Europe. And since the mid-1800s, the European eugenicists, as evidence of the supremacy of their own race, they pointed back to the fact that large skeletons had been found in Bronze Age European burial mounds. So when you hear stories about giants being found in ancient European burial mounds, you're talking about the same evidence that the first European and American eugenicists relied on to support their own theory of racial supremacy. And so for all of these extremely large skeletons to be found in the mounds of the ancestral Native Americans was a real challenge to the theories of this international eugenics cult. And Elis Hrdlicka, when he became the head of the Department of Anthropology at the Smithsonian, launched the policy of denial for the first time. He became the first person to deny the existence of the remains. He publicly denied the existence of the remains. When he did interviews, he would bring up the giants just to explain that they'd never actually been found. But Hrdlicka was a part of a purge of ancient Native American history that was being done at the time in order to justify this sort of arcane pseudoscience that was taking over the United States and for some time dominated our political life, because the politicians were completely on board with it. At a certain point, the United States Department of Agriculture had partnered with the Carnegie family to begin constructing gas chambers in public in the United States. And the goal was to use these eventually to get rid of all of the undesirables. So,
oh, wow. I didn't know anything about that part. That's great.
Yeah, there's an entire postscript at the end of our book that covers the entire history of eugenics, and we show with in several instances, in their own words, we're using people like Madison Grant, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, and Hitler's own eugenicists. We show in their own words that the existence of a race of ancient giants in their own genetic ancestry was the integral pillar of their belief system. So if you begin to find skeletal remains in the history of races that you're seeking to classify as inferior, then that evidence becomes problematic. And then, as now, people with an agenda have tried to use science in order to influence the government to implement policies that they find desirable. I mean, you can look at how global warming is being used today as an excuse for population reduction. It's
Absolutely.
no different. It's no different than that. And so what happened is these eugenicists were responsible for the loss of the tall ones from history. And then in more recent times, because so many writers on the subject have connected these remains with concepts like the Nephilim or ancient aliens, the archaeologists today have had a knee-jerk reaction to the information without even really taking a really good, solid look at it. And that is the reason, as I see it, for the situation that we have today.
So, quick question. How do you feel this whole race of tall people was wiped out? Did they just die off? How do you feel? Is there any evidence to collaborate on how they died, or they just went extinct? What is the information on that?
They didn't.
The dispersal theory.
I can tell you this: there are hundreds of accounts of these large remains from the Adena-Hopewell mounds, which date to between 2,500 years ago and about 1,500 years ago. But the mound builder cultures in different forms persisted from that time period all the way up to European contact. And there are just as many large skeletons in the more recent mounds. In fact, one of the gigantic skeletons that people on the internet have called everything from a survivor of Atlantis to an ancient Celt actually was only buried a few hundred years ago and was found with Spanish trade goods. So the tall ones did not disappear. And in fact, there are Native American people living today who still possess traces of this anthropology, and some of them are athletes. I can give you guys a wonderful example. There's a man with an Iroquois heritage who died in 1984 named Max Palmer. And Max Palmer is the second largest and tallest professional wrestler who ever lived. He was also an actor in several science fiction films, and he was an inheritor of this anthropology. He was, by a very young age, he was already extremely tall and powerfully built. His mother had tests run to see if anything was wrong with him. He did not have any genetic disorder. And this individual is a descendant of the tall ones in historic times. And there are photographs, there's video footage of him you can find on the internet. And he also was a preacher. He called himself Goliath for Jesus Christ. So these are human beings, and for whatever the reason, this incredible genetic feature was a part of the Native American heritage, and it must go back to the original founding population of Native Americans tens of thousands of years ago, because the remains of the tall ones have been found in the tombs of both the southern and northern branches of Native American founders that split apart more than 10,000 years ago. That means that this heritage must go back to the first Native American ancestors to enter the United States.
So we had a couple of people on before about, crystals and stuff like that. And going back to what you said about special water, like with Ohio and Virginia, what's so, maybe you can answer this, so special about like the North and like Virginia and stuff? Because it seems like a lot of mythical creatures and just like crystals and powers are up in the northern regions in Canada and stuff. What's so special about the water up there? Because you said they need special waters.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The closer you get to the Great Lakes and the closer you get to the Atlantic Ocean, the more sacred and powerful and numinous the landscape becomes. And if you'll approach it with an open mind, even you yourself will experience it. There are, first, the reason. The reason is the Great Lakes area thousands of years ago, going back maybe 8,000 or 9,000 years. The Great Lakes region was a hotbed of the mythology of an entity that in Native American lore is known as the Great Horned Serpent or the Underwater Panther. There are two different forms of the same mythic being. The Ojibwa call him Mishibishu, but he has many different names in different language groups and cultures. And this being lives in the underworld, which is a vast underground ocean. And he enters into our domain in the earth world through lakes, streams, oceans, springs, everything that has naturally occurring water, but especially the Great Lakes, because there in the Great Lakes is one of the world's largest ancient supplies of copper. And Mishibishu's scales are made of copper. He was believed to be the lord of all copper from the Great Lakes. And what happened about 3,000 years ago was that copper became the number one most sought after item in North America. We have exchange networks reaching from the Great Lakes all across North America, all the way south to Florida. And wherever the copper was transferred, the mythology of the underwater serpent the great dragon who lived in the Great Lakes and who entered our domain through all of the watery outlets in nature transferred with it. And for this reason, the ancient lakes and the rivers are endowed with a type of numinosity in the Native American mind. It's as if they became a mirror upon which the contents of the unconscious were projected in myth.
That's crazy. I forgot the episode. Craig can probably. It was like the Michigan episode. You talked about the copper and the copper. I was like, why copper? Like, what is so special about copper? And now you say copper again. I'm like, man, copper.
The copper was special because the copper was seen as a gift from the underwater serpent.
Huh.
It was believed to be a metal intimately connected with his power, and you have to realize that this being was believed to give long life, was believed to have the ability to bestow great medical powers, power over the hunt, but copper was also sacred to his adversaries, who are the thunderbirds that live in the above world. And for 6,000 years or more, the Native American Algonquian people of the Great Lakes have a tradition that when a great thunderstorm rages over the Great Lakes, that it is literally a conflict between the thunderbirds and the great serpent from under the lakes. And for them, this conflict is real. It isn't happening in another world or dimension. It isn't happening between beings that you cannot see. They believe that they see these beings and that this conflict is literally unfolding in nature year by year.
Huh.
And this belief system was the same belief system that the mound builders attempted to write out in their earthworks. For example, in southern Ohio, the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio is an effigy of the underworld king, Mishivishu, the underworld serpent. There are several Hopewell mounds that we wrote about in our book that had gigantic stone effigies of thunderbirds under the mounds. So this cosmology is many millennia old, and in truth, you can see it reflected in every culture around the world. You'll find in every mythology and religious tradition around the world some story of an underworld serpent at war with a being from on high that can take the form of a bird. We could talk about Typhon and Horus in Egyptian mythology. We could talk about any number of mythologies. So it's probable that this is the oldest mythology on Earth.
So what's it going to take to get you to go, live stream and go excavate one of these mounds? So that way they can't do anything about it. It's live on air. You're digging away out there like Oak Island. Jason Gerald's version of the Oak Island. We're going to be at some burial mound as we're going through, and we're going to be in the third season. And you're going to finally find that little pinky bone.
We'll volunteer to be your camera crew.
Yeah.
Well, that's quite generous. As long as the swear jar stays open.
Yeah, that's right.
As long as the swear jar comes with us. But I have my position on that. It surprises a lot of people because I don't believe in excavating any more Indian mounds than we already have for any reason. Simply for the fact that archaeologically, we have tens of thousands of these artifacts. We have hundreds and hundreds of radiocarbon dates. We have thousands of skeletal remains. I am not an advocate of any further excavations of these ancient graves because in the end, these are human beings. As I said before, there have been DNA tests done. The issue is those DNA tests, in order to get access to them, I had to travel and go to actual university archives. They have not been published on the internet, so everyone that gets involved in this subject can't find them. But they have been done. These are Native Americans. These are human beings. And as far as finding the bones of a giant, they've already been found, photographed, and acknowledged in the excavation reports of archaeologists for decades. You can read the book Mounds for the Dead by Don Dragoo or the Dover Mound Site Report by William S. Webb, any number of reports by George Fisher from Pennsylvania. The tall ones have the tall ones have already been discovered and acknowledged. And the idea that they're still missing or we need to prove they exist, this idea only exists because people don't realize the information that's actually out there. They're ignorant of the totality of what's been published in the literature. And once you look at all the evidence out there, you realize that that this information is already available. And that's just one. Those are some of the reasons that I just don't. I'm not an advocate for excavating any more of these mounds.
So are a lot of these sites protected, or somebody could just build a house on it today? Or a lot of these sites, what are these sites actually? Are they protected? Are private people own them? Or
well, they're protected until Walmart wants to build over top of one, which is what happened here in West Virginia recently. There was an ancient burial site along the Kanawha River that had never been properly excavated, and a major retailer came in and built a store right on top of it against the protests of the local people. It happens all the time, but the laws are different from state to state.
okay.
In many places, well, in many places, if it's on your property, you can do what you want with it. But
Walmart's haunted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that site, did you have a chance to excavate it, or Walmart just bought it and just tore it up?
They bought it and tore it up. The people were trying to protect the site, and it was destroyed. You see, in America, when it comes to the justice system, there are really two tiers. People with money can take advantage of this law as much as they can take advantage of any law. And especially in Ohio, a lot of people who don't realize that there's a real Native American identity to the mound builders are basing that on what archaeologists from Ohio say. And the reason that the archaeologists in Ohio claim that they don't know whose ancestors built the mounds is because as soon as you attribute those mounds to a specific tribe, that tribe has exclusive right to decide who has access to those mounds, and that's where their money comes from. And that's why I encourage people that are interested in this subject, look at the archaeology on the mounds that's being done in places outside of Ohio, because the anthropologists and archaeologists are teaming up with language experts, and they're identifying whose heritage this culture belongs to on a regular basis.
Yeah,
that's stupid. I mean, we've seen movies and stuff building on top of ancient burial grounds. So, nope, I'm good.
Well, it's
horrific accents always happen on the chip aisle. That store. There's just something that goes on.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
America's ruining a lot of things, man. I mean, down here in Florida, I used to work in the villages, and it's the villages. Every single day they're moving. I think my father-in-law told me that they used to move 1 million yards of dirt a day. Mm-hmm. And the fuel guy used to find at least 10 to 15 arrowheads a day. I mean, it's just crazy how much we're tearing up, and we have no idea.
That's because Florida was a hotbed of the Hopewell culture. In fact, if you ever go to the Crystal River Mounds, you'll be visiting a site of the culture we're talking about right now.
You say Crystal River?
Crystal River Mounds, yeah.
I'm going there next July. I want to go check it out.
That was built by the people we're talking about. And in my next book, actually, I have several giants found in Florida and some of those mounds that we'll be talking about. Cape Canaveral was actually built on top of a burial ground from which many large bones were found over the centuries.
Interesting.
Oh, wow, that's pretty close to us.
Yeah, Jason, this trade network was pretty extensive.
Well, it reached all the way to Yellowstone National Park in the west, and it stretched from southern Ontario to the coast of Florida and all along the entire Atlantic coast. It was massive. And it wasn't just a trade network. It was a way that people got along. It's interesting that a lot of people believe that the giants were these warlike, cannibalistic, Nephilim-like Nephilim-like creatures. But the fact is that the archaeological record tells us that during the time period of these cultures, there was a period of relative peace throughout the Ohio Valley and the Tennessee River Valley. And that's because the exchange network, it allowed people to commune with one another across large distances. There were marriages made across long distances, friendships, and the youth were able to live the way that the ancient Greeks did, in that you could follow these trails across the country to find objects which had some type of mythical association or power, such as obsidian from Yellowstone National Park or copper from southern Ontario. And then you could bring it home, and you would know for the rest of your life that you'd been to the lair of the water panther and claimed your copper. So the network that they lived in, it was an extraordinary thing, especially because it shows what can be done without modern technology, I think.
I'm fairly new to the whole burial mound, phenomenon. So like I just brought up a picture right here. This is that Crystal River archaeological site that you're talking about. This is one of the burial mounds down there. So are these things typically laid out in a semi-standard format? How you have like Egyptian tombs. I mean, did they typically when they did these burial mounds, did they orient the burials in a certain way?
Diversity is the number one rule when it comes to studying this culture, because the local shaman, the local burial priest had absolute autonomy to elaborate the rites of the dead and the way that the mounds were built. The Adena-Hopewell lived in what is called a heterarchical society. And in a heterarchical society, no one has permanent lasting power that they wield over other people at all times. People hold different social roles that become activated when they're needed. And the designers and architects of the mounds were like that. So when it came time to design a mound, they were free to elaborate the formula however they wished. We have some mounds in Kentucky where the floor of the mound is stripped, covered in sacred clay, and then the cremated ashes of the dead are scattered together and intermingled on the floor of the mound, and then the mound is raised over that. In Charleston, West Virginia, they built large log cabin-like structures inside the mounds and placed the dead in a semicircle inside the log structure. So depending on which region we're in, we see different trends arise in burial, because burial was the highest art form. The way that you buried your dead was the ultimate expression of your creative instinct.
Wow, that's crazy.
Put up here, so like here's some, like you said, these were renderings basically of what they think that they could have looked like.
So these are images that were created by Marcia K. Moore, who is an artist that we partnered with for our book, and the images are based on actual artifacts that have been found with Adena and Hopewell burials. The one you're seeing right now, the bear costume, that is a bear shaman. A figurine of this individual was found with a gigantic skeleton at the Newark Earthworks in Ohio. But all of the skulls and faces for these recreations are from photographs of actual Adena and Hopewell skulls. So the artist was attempting with these images to recreate as accurate a profile as possible of what some of these people looked like. That's an Adena female from the Wright Mound in Kentucky. So the male with the large horned headdress. Now, this is an interesting image because the skull that was used for this image also came from the Wright Mound in Kentucky, but the copper headdress comes from a Hopewell mound in southern Ohio, and that headdress was worn to represent the great horned serpent of the underworld that we were talking about earlier. And the copper gorget was probably an artifact that was somehow associated with that motif as well. And the copper headdresses with the horns, some archaeologists believe that they were worn by shamanic priests who made sacrifices to the underworld powers so that the powers would not attack the living through the year, because the underwater serpents were considered very malignant and dangerous creatures. They could cause plagues, floods, drownings. In fact, by the time of European contact, the Native Americans had by and large attempted to avoid the great horned serpent, the underwater serpent, at all costs. It had come to be regarded as a totally malignant being. So something must have happened between modern times and the time of the mound builders to sort of shake up the relationship between mankind and these powers.
Yeah, Jason, since you've been giving us a pretty detailed account of the trade networks, the copper, we know a lot of the burials had copper bracelets on them. Okay, so we know some of the structure of the society. But were the Adena people also involved with the archaeoastronomy topic as well?
Something tells me that you already know the answer to that question. The Adena-Hopewell were the greatest archaeoastronomers in the history of the world.
Bill paid me to give him a plug for his book.
Right. Well, you can check out Bill's book. It's called The Archaeology of the Sacred by William Romaine, and it is the best book you can ever read on the archaeoastronomy of the Adena-Hopewell. And the Adena-Hopewell, they constructed earthworks of circles, squares, and occasionally triangles, octagons, and other more abstract designs that were aligned to solar and lunar events. And that makes them unique because no other earthwork building culture in the eastern woodlands aligned their earthworks to the moon. There was something very important about the moon to the Adena-Hopewell in southern Ohio. In fact, at the Newark earthworks in Licking County, there's a massive circle, a gigantic octagon, and several other features that were built to track the cycle of the moon through the year. And one of the articles that we recently published was about the significance of the moon to this culture. And we believe that it's probably because their chief deity was an ancient form of an Algonquian moon goddess named Cockumthina. And Cockumthina was the mistress of the land of the dead. The souls of the dead would return to her if they had a safe journey through the other world. And she was also the source of the souls of the newborn who were coming into the world of the living. And we found that there are a great many burial sites where young children or young females are buried with crescent ornaments made of either copper or mica. And so it could be that the archaeoastronomy is tied into this mythology of the ancient lunar goddess. But long story short, the Adena-Hopewell, the earthworks that they designed were created so that they interconnected over many, many miles. In fact, Will Romaine has published research that suggests that the entire face of the state of Ohio may have been one gigantic interconnected earthworks complex that basically writes out the story of the journey of the soul after death on the earth.
Okay, and Jason, people can read your and Sarah's the Adena-Hopewell Moon Unveiled parts 1 and 2 in Ancient American editions 126 and 127.
Yeah, and you can also read a condensed version of that on our website, Paradigm Collision, as well.
Okay, I think we have been putting that in the chat room.
Yep, we've had that scrolling on the bottom there.
Okay.
Collision.
And the next edition of Ancient American that's coming out in December, we're publishing a small taste of the DNA research that we've been doing on this, because there's a real need for this information to get out there with some of the theories that are being promoted about these people. It's sort of become our mission to rescue them from the idea that these are somehow related to the cannibalistic giants of biblical lore. So that some of that information will be in the next edition of Ancient American as well.
Ancient Aliens has that effect on a lot of different. Yep.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you mentioned Ancient Aliens, because I did that show several years ago, and the producer who I worked with and who Mark worked with, Mark was really the person that made it happen, because he's the most connected person in radio. Yes. And he knows everyone. I think that he might know Jared Kushner also, but when I agreed to do that show, I had a conversation with the producer, and I said, listen, I don't even believe in the existence of extraterrestrials, but I will do the show to share the evidence that I have with the rest of the world. And she was very understanding about that. And interestingly enough, they let that producer go eventually. And I think it might have been because she was too reasonable. But some of the evidence that we actually shared on the episode was we put on screen the handwritten notes of an agent of the Smithsonian measuring a gigantic skeleton in a burial mound here in Charleston, West Virginia. It's in his own handwriting. And we actually reproduced that account in our book as well. So for people who don't believe that the Smithsonian did find these remains, I mean, the evidence is so overwhelming that I think you'd have to be blind not to see it.
And that's one, kind of, I teased that a little bit there too. It's just for me, the Smithsonian, I mean, this is one, if it's already there, I mean, I would love to see these.
The mounds?
Yeah, well, not just the mounds, but some of the remains that have been found, to show, here's people that were potentially 7 to 8 feet tall. I mean, this is something, we've been told on it. Yeah, no, that was, like you said, this is just a junk pile that they buried. That's
correct. They would use the term rubbish very often. With the bones, unfortunately, when the Smithsonian, I don't know if you've ever visited the Smithsonian, but when you go to the area where they keep these bones, unfortunately, it's a bunch of drawers, and they didn't bother to organize any of the bones or artifact by mound. So we have no real way of knowing which bones came from which mound. We simply know they came from Charleston. And Norris, the excavating agent who excavated the mounds in 1884, we have obtained his personal diary that he wrote in every day of the excavations by his own hand. And the bones of the giants during the excavation were destroyed, except one of the skulls was actually shipped to the Smithsonian, I believe, or at least part of one of the skulls. So just because we see the Smithsonian document the remains, when you see a report that says that a giant skeleton has been found, that never means that there's a guarantee that the skeleton was recovered. Most of the ancient remains that the Smithsonian recovered during the work of the Eastern Mound Division were so badly handled that they disintegrated, or they were thrown in the trash. Many times the excavating agent would just throw them in a ditch. And that actually happened in Georgia at some of the most important mounds there. There's a Mississippian era burial mound in Georgia where a gigantic skeleton approaching 8 feet in height was found by a Smithsonian agent who simply threw the bones in the trash.
Get out of here.
That was their practice at the time. They were given a job. They were given a limited time to do it, and the government gave them a limited amount of cash. And these were people mostly who had no interest in archaeology. They were just looking for a quick buck. In many cases, it was nepotism. There were people who were related to ranking members in the Smithsonian hierarchy who needed a job, and so they were given the job of excavating ancient burial mounds.
Quote unquote, that's what they were told to do, throw them in a ditch.
Is there any wonder that it's not, the whole area isn't just ripe with hauntings?
It is ripe with hauntings.
Yeah, I mean, there's no wonder. I mean, you've got all these burial sites. I'm like, is there any place that you basically can go now where bricks haven't been made with some ground? Like, oh my God, no wonder things fly off the walls.
Well, the fact is, too, that when it's not just the mounds, the Adena-Hopewell constructed these enclosures, these large circular enclosures, usually with a single entryway. These are circular earth walls that represented, they're basically a cross section of an axis mundi that connects the world above, the world we live in, and the world below us. And when you consider that a place like Charleston, West Virginia, there's an image there that Mark's holding up. That's a map of Charleston, West Virginia's circular hinges. These circular hinges were cross sections of a sacred tree that the shamans would travel to the underworld and to the heavens and commune with the souls of the dead. So if you're a superstitious person, it may be a bad idea to completely obliterate them and then to lay concrete on top of them. So if you're into the supernatural, my advice to you would be to get a copy of the Smithsonian's reports and then find the cities that have been built over these ancient sites and investigate there.
Yeah, there's different, like I said, the different ones.
Yeah, they represent in this ancient cosmology, the Earth was considered a flat disk, an island that floated on top of the primordial sea of the underworld. And the circular hinge containing the flat disk inside was considered the dome or barrier that covers over and surrounds the Earth island. And the shamanic belief system was that these places are places where in altered states of consciousness, one could ascend and descend the tree that connects different worlds and interact with the beings that are there, which includes the thunderbirds, the great serpents, and the souls of the dead. In the case of the Newark earthworks in Ohio, we have put forth the theory now that that site may have been a communal site where the shaman would reach out, and maybe hundreds of people at a time would reach out to the moon goddess Kakamthina. So destroying these sites and building houses on top of them is probably not a good idea.
No,
not at all.
No, wow. I'm just buyers beware. You might want to do a little history work. Contact.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, go to paradigmcollision.com and just write Jason and Sarah. It's like, hey, I'm looking to buy this house right here. What do you think? No.
Yeah, it's fascinating. If you look at certain places, like the area here in Charleston, there were between 8 and 10 sacred temples and between 40 and 50 burial mounds. Today, all that's left of that are 3 burial mounds. And one of those burial mounds has European graves intruded into the top of it. So here's an ancient Adena burial mound with the tombstones of white settlers intruded into the top of it in the corner of a cemetery in Charleston. The largest surviving mound in Charleston sits on D Street, and you can go there any time of the year and watch people let their kids play on the mound and tear pieces of it out and ride sleighs up and down the mound during Christmas time. And for someone like myself, that's a really sacred part of history, because I have a great deal of respect and admiration for the Native American traditions and cosmology, and I feel like they've taught me a lot through my research. And so it's an issue, And you're absolutely right. It's a form of great sacrilege to rampantly destroy something like that and then to build some modern behemoth on top of it. When you look at what we build today, it's as if the greatest skill we can come up with is to create a rectangular concrete block, and we think that must be better than what was there before. But in many cases, when it comes to the ancient cultures, that's just not true.
So who owns that piece of land off of D Street that you were just referring to?
The city. It's a public park.
Oh, it's a public. They built a park. They built a park there.
Craig has one of the photos, or a couple of the photos.
Yeah, that's actually the mound where we shot the Ancient Aliens episode, and the Smithsonian account that we have in our book talks about a skeleton that was close to 7 feet tall being found in this mound as well. There was a timber hinge, a giant post circle of timbers under this mound, and there were 11 burials under the mound. 10 of the burials were in a semicircle around the large burial, and the large burial had a copper crown or a headdress, some sort of copper object worn on the skull.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and Jason, you discussed these log or the mounds were built around like the 3 samples of log cabins that were found under the mounds. There's we kind of just touched on some of the engineering. The trade networks were really extensive. They knew how to navigate over long distances and haul stuff from you said like Yellowstone Park and
Obsidian.
Yeah, and there's evidence from coming up from Florida, but also in your Ages of the Giants books, you cover some of the engineering projects, like the parallel walls. Maybe there was some kind of road leading into the Charleston area. Can you tell us a little bit about not all the engineering was focused on just the mounds?
Well, no. In fact, here in Charleston, I mentioned the 50 mounds in Charleston on both sides of the river. Well, in the notebooks of Norris, the agent of the Smithsonian that actually saw this site, he wrote about a type of a sacred pathway that connected the mounds that was made of a very hard clay. And this clay pathway actually at the cross sections was marked by megalithic stones with petroglyphs. And we have no idea what those stones looked like. We have no idea what the petroglyphs were like, except that it included holes, because this information was deleted from the Smithsonian's official account. So the sites, when you see these ancient maps of these sites, just know that there was more there than what's even in the published account. There's a lot that's been lost. So in my opinion, I think that these sacred landscapes were probably being built to intentionally reflect either constellations or patterns in the stars, or they were literally meant to be recreations of the land of the dead. So you have different locations that are marked with sacred stones, sacred pathways. The most common way that the sacred pathways were created in Ohio is through raising parallel walls of earth that usually mark an important sunrise or moonrise location, because the cycles of the sun and the moon were so integral to their archaeoastronomy.
Jason, with all these public works, to build roads, ceremonial paths. We know there are, the Mounds line, a 60-mile, both sides of a 60-mile stretch of a river. There are these roads, and you also get the pathways going from a river to a mound. Is there some kind of reliable estimate to gauge the size of the population? I mean, you have to have a pretty large labor force to engineer these kind of structures.
Well, the population size is very difficult to determine because of the cremation practices.
Okay, that's an issue.
But the largest mounds, it's important to remember, some of the Adena mounds are 30 or even 70 feet high. The populations that built the mounds built them up over generations. So you're going to have a burial event where multiple tribes and families converge at the same place to bury their dead in the same mound, and then they're going to disperse. And then we don't know how much time could pass before the decision is made to put more of their dead in the same mound. In some cases, we have mounds that can date all the way back to the Archaic period, to 1500 BC, and then there are burials made as recently as 1700 years ago. So the mounds are built by accretion in many cases. And when it comes to designing earthworks and mounds, we know that these were multiple community projects. The people would gather from a wide area, multiple tribes, multiple people would come together to the same place to build these earthworks and mounds. But these are people who otherwise may have spent most of the year dispersed and separate from one another. So whatever form their actual belief system took, the gathering together to periodically build these structures was an integral part of it. And we know that because one reason we know, there have been some really good studies done on the mounds in Kentucky, in which the archaeologists have basically come to the conclusion that when multiple communities buried their dead together in a single mound, they were adopting a common ancient ancestry. So if you buried your loved one in the same mound that another family buried their loved one, you were then of the same ancestry as them. The dead in the other world were now a family, and that meant that you in this world were now a common family. And in fact, that means that these mounds were probably the origin of the tribal unit as we understand it here in the Eastern Woodlands.
And unfortunately, we're going to have to make that the stopping point right there. I just looked, we're running out of time. It's gone that quick. But everybody, you need to go to paradigmcollision.com. It's also through, is it Lulu? Is that
the book is published through lulu.com. That's LULU.com.
And it's Ages of the Giants, A Cultural History of the Tall Ones in Prehistoric America by Jason Terrell and it's Sarah Farmer. Everybody, go to their site, check that out, purchase that book, get more information on this. Fascinating topic. Apologize, I had to cut you, had to stop you right there. We could have kept going, but I just want to thank you for coming on. We had a great time. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and luckily we didn't have to add Chris's swear jar.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
I said, we'll be in touch because I definitely am. Especially as we're going through all these topics, we keep getting these overlays, and definitely we're going to probably need to have you back on for your expertise in the future.
Okay, I'll be glad to do it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to checking out your book. So thanks again, Jason. I really appreciate you coming on, and have a great night, and we'll talk soon.
Yes.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.
So everybody go to paradigmcollision.com. There it is. It's up on the screen there. Go check out their book. Amazing work. Very well researched. Very well done. You will not, you'll definitely get the information that we weren't able to get to here on our time. And as always, Mark, Eddie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For anybody that go support Tim and Barbara DeLong on Nightlight, you can see them on YouTube. Go subscribe to that channel. Go watch his shows. Give him a hard time. Mention Chris's swear jar, and he'll know exactly where you saw him from. Yeah. But Mark, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the opportunity. It was fun. I enjoy working with the three of you.
Thank you.
Thank
We
you,
appreciate
definitely.
it. Yeah, it's been a great time. So yeah, we'll talk here soon. Like I said, we'll wrap this up. So everybody, go sponsors Brat's Beard Care. Go Kelly Brat makes an amazing product. BratsBeardCare.com. Use promo code 3beards with a capital B. You're going to save 20% off your entire order on beard soap, oils, comb, you name it, shipping. Go to Nanny Cakes 407 on Facebook, or give her a call at 407-923-2898. Amazing cake products here in the Central Florida area. You're going to save 15% off by just mentioning that us three bearded crazies. And that is an amazing deal. Outside the Central Florida area, you're going to get amazing tasting whatever comes to you. But it won't look anything like you ordered it, but I guarantee it'll taste amazing.
So it tastes good.
Yeah.
And by the way,
Beard.
and by the way, if you don't have a beard, you can go dust them chap lips off with Kelly Brat's chapstick. Winter's coming up, so make sure you dust them lips.
Yeah, he's got hand soap too. Foam and hand soap.
There you go. 3beardspodcast.com. Go to patreon.com/3beards.
Damn it. We gotta get in order, man, because you always skip around.
I do it just to mess with you.
I'm trying.
All right, everybody. Thank you for watching. Appreciate it. Thanks again, Jason Gerald, for coming on the show. Mark Eddy, thank you again for getting us in touch with him. Everybody have a great night. Appreciate you watching. Thank you, and good night.
Good night.